Okay, let's see now. Shut that down. Then we go to this, and then we go to busy. Joe said he was busy burning dinner, so we'll share. All right. Okay. Hello, everyone. The first of just a second, it came and went. The It's the 1st of February, and we are going to read today the German ideology, which should be relatively quick. And I may show some video from a meeting that just got posted that includes a lot of famous Marxist lights, I think, including Rick Wolf and some other folks, Radica and a bunch of other folks about alternative economic systems. So that should actually be moderately exciting. But we may switch to that if I get bored with myself yakking. I found this article on Farewell to the German Ideology. The German Ideology is a text by Marx, 1845. It sits in this funny little period and isn't really discovered or it's rediscovered in the post-war era, although it emerges as a construction by all those people fiddling around in the archives in the late 20s and 30s, and it gets kind of sort of placed as a kind of thing. It's never really written as quote unquote the German ideology, and it is a response to a variety of other folks, and it is a it has a philosophical bent to it relative to Feuerbach, etc. So on the one hand, it seems like a trivial piece. On the other hand, it was really meant for wider consumption and an anthology of some kind that Marx and Engels were working on. And it is a joint piece by Marx and Engels, so it has that element in it for good or bad. So there's this it's a little article by Sarah Johnson in the Journal of the History of Ideas, January 2022. So it has a certain recency. So I'll read that, and I hope that people will get a little something out of it. Uh, and it fits into the weekly Marx thing because we're really still dealing with Marx's texts. And as you note, I've been fiddling around back and forth with various things that are mainly interpretations and commentaries and sort of sub ideas. And I've also been throwing out a couple of other ideas that I've been sort of fiddling around with that nobody else is doing. And I keep looking for those sort of margins to work in, because I think that's what academia is best left with these days. So here we go. As Friedrich Engels was sorting through Karl Marx's papers shortly after his death, he found several manuscripts that they had written together 4 decades earlier in 1845 to 46, when they were both living in Brussels. He told Marx's daughter Laura that one of these was so funny that he would have to read it to her sometime. We were bold devils then, he recalled. Heine's poetry is childlike innocence compared with our prose. This delightful manuscript was among those that Marx had described in a contribution to the Critique of Political Economy of 1859, where he recounted their decision to set forth together our view as opposed to the ideological one of German philosophy, in fact, to settle accounts with our former philosophical conscience. The intention was carried out in the form of a critique of post-Hegelian philosophy. The manuscript, 2 large octavo volumes, had long ago reached the publishers in Westphalia when we were informed that owing to changed circumstances, it could not be printed. We allowed the manuscript to the gnawing criticism of the mice, all the more willingly since we had achieved our main purpose, and that is self-clarification. That is probably all of this and that is self-clarification. Engels saw things differently in the late 1880s. At that time, both the Marxist world outlook and German philosophy were more influential than they had been before. So he felt it was important to explain the relationship between his and Marxist thought and Hegelian philosophy, and especially Feuerbach's influence upon them. But Engels also reported that the old manuscript of 1845 to 46 could not help him with this work. The part on Feuerbach was incomplete. They had never even started a critique of his doctrine. The finished portion, he explained, consists of an exposition of the materialist conception of history, which proves only how incomplete our knowledge of economic history still was at that time. David Ryazanov was keen to find this manuscript in the early 1920s as he embarked upon an ambitious project at the Marx Engels Institute in Moscow. He and his staff were collecting everything that Marx and Engels had written, their published writings, of course, but also their drafts, unpublished and unfinished works, outlines, fragments, and letters, with the aim of preparing a complete edition of this material. That is the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, that is the MEGA. In 1923, Ryazanov visited the Social Democratic Party archives in Berlin, where most of the Marx Engels papers were then held, and among the photographs that he carried back to Moscow were images of the manuscript from 1845 to 46. He called it the German Ideology, Deutsche Ideologie, title that Franz Mehring, M-E-H-R-I-N-G, Mehring first used in 1902 after he connected the author's scattered references to an unpublished manuscript with Marx's description from 1847 of a quote-unquote writing on the German ideology. As Marx put it then, this was a critique of modern German philosophy as expounded by its representatives, Feuerbach, Bauer, and Stirner, and of German socialism as expounded by its various prophets. Razanov thought it was a remarkable, important work. It shed light on the intellectual development of Marx and Engels, as well as the broader history of ideas in the 19th century. And he considered the part in Feuerbach to be exceptional in this regard. In 1926, when he published Feuerbach in German, he wrote that it was indeed unfinished, as Engels had warned, and incoherent too. Pages were missing, text was crossed out, and its different parts did not fit together. But otherwise, Ryazanov agreed with Engels' assessment. The critique of Feuerbach may have been inchoate, but it was there, and Engels had been modest to so quickly dismiss its claims about history. Die Deutsche Ideologie was published 6 years later in 1932 in volume 1/5 of the MEGA. Vladimir Odoratsky wrote in his introduction that the contents of this volume, quote, are of the highest theoretical, historical, and practical value, unquote. Here he explained that Marx and Engels appear as champions of the proletariat, as leaders of the developing Communist Party, as advocates of dialectical materialism. They develop ideas about epistemology, logic, and art, and the unfinished Feuerbach section, they present the first systematic exposition of their historico-philosophical conception of the economic development of mankind. In 1939, Roy Pascal offered the German ideology to the Anglophone world as the, quote, first and most comprehensive statement of the historical materialism, and, quote, the first full statement of Marxism, albeit in an abridged form. Now, what's interesting, of course, by 1945, California's Joint Fact-Finding Committee on Un-American Activities, remember, there's all this anti-communist stuff that comes from the establishment, I think prior to World War II, of the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And of course, it reproduces itself in places like California, where you have this entire history of right-wing nuttery, largely in Southern California. Anyway, had studied it for the key to the Communist Party's strategy. Yet it's really all there. The full text finally appeared in English in 1964, and in the 1970s, selections were placed in anthologies that remain widely taught today. That's probably this whole business. You know, the quotes, the sections from the German ideology that do appear in collections like Tucker's, etc., which, you know, undergraduates would read it and go, well, the rest of the German ideology must be as coherent as the fragment I'm reading. Generations of students, scholars, and other interested parties have thus come to know Marxist thought with the aid of this text. And now, almost a century after we were given the German ideology, a new MEGA 1/5 presents a wondrous fact. Quote, an integral or even just a fragmentary work called the German ideology from the pen of Marx and Engels does not exist. Well, you know, it just yammers on. This leaves one last question. How should we refer to all this material together? The editors suggest one possibility with the name of the Amiga 2 1/5 German ideology manuscripts and printed text. Now, what does it mean? A reader who finds these words on the title page and Deutsche Ideologie on the spine may well assume that what lies before her is the surviving material for a work called the German ideology. Nothing that she reads in the text line would lead her to think otherwise. But if this reader should open the apartment, she would quickly learn the wondrous news, quote, just what I just read before, an integral or even a fragmentary work does not exist. The rest of the introduction's first paragraph would relate the origin and fate of the volume's content in brief, that Marx and Engels wrote most of these manuscripts for a quarterly journal, but the journal project failed, so they tried to publish this material as a standalone two-volume publication, perhaps as a single abridged volume. Our reader might then wonder, if there never was a work called the German ideology, not even a draft, then what is the titular German ideology? What does it mean to say that the Amiga contains its manuscripts? So, so I mean, it's there. It's, you can get an audio component of it, and that's what I attached here in the video. But it's problematic, and fortunately I didn't put the entire article because it plows along with the differences in various pages. It even has pictures, I assume from photostats or whatever that Razanov took, and it's got massive scribblings and all kinds of other wacky stuff on it. So it is pretty amazing. But it's my understanding the Amiga includes some of that you can get online, which one should track down anyway. So the following is what the Wikipedia indicates for the German ideology. That is also known as a critique of the German ideology, the set of manuscripts written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels around April or early May 1846. Marx and Engels did not find a publisher, but the work was retrieved and first published in 1932 by the Soviet Union's Marx-Engels-Lenin Institute. The book uses satirical polemics to critique modern German philosophy, particularly that of young Hegelians such as Marx's former mentor Bruno Bauer, Ludwig Feuerbach, and Max Stirner's The Ego and Its Own. It criticizes ideology as a form of historical idealism as opposed to Marx's historical materialism, the materialist conception of history. Let me break there for a second. And this is the opposition that we see when, trying to deal with questions of ideology and critique, is the contrast between, and I think you noticed that when we were looking at Lenin a couple of days ago, the contrast between idealisms and materialisms. The first part of Volume 1 also examines the division of labor and Marx's theory of human nature, on which he states that humans, quote, distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence. Through the publication of the first volume of the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the MEGA, it was possible to show that, and this is a fairly long little quote here, Marx and Engels did not write the manuscripts on the German ideology as a part of a book project, but part of a magazine project in which other authors, Moses Hess, George Wirth, Wilhelm Weitling, were also involved. For this reason, a manuscript written by Roland Daniels, which was edited by Marx and Engels for the planned quarterly publication, is being printed in this volume for the first time. And in terms of content, it was not initially the systematic elaboration of one's own theoretical positions that was the concern, but instead the polemical debate with young Hegelian and socialist contemporaries. However, the focus of the criticism of Marx and Engels was not on Feuerbach, as was mostly assumed up to now, but on Max Stirner, the author of the radical individualist work, The Unique One and His Property of 1844. It could be proven that the majority of what the recipients of the last century saw as Chapter 1, Feuerbach, was originally written in controversy with Stirner. This also applies to the genesis of such central concepts as ideology and petit bourgeois. Those terms really persist, of course, in Marxist discourse. In addition, there are numerous digressions in which Marx and Engels present their own positions, depictions of the historical development of the German bourgeoisie, the relationship between intellectual and material rule, that is, intellectual rule and material rule, and the history of private property. It was only during the course of this discussion that Marx and Engels made the decision to present their views in a separate chapter and combine them with a critique of Feuerbach. To this end, they removed central parts of the text of the Stirner and Bauer criticism from the context of their composition. These text developments are documented in detail in the apparatus volume. The text critical apparatus, with its discursive presentation of variants, makes the drafting process transparent. And in particular, the intensive collaboration between Marx and Engels on the manuscripts comprehensible. I almost leaped forward to say that it was incomprehensible. So it had a general outline. And this is the general outline as described by Wikipedia. Marx and Engels argue that humans distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce their means of subsistence to support their needs. What individuals are coincides with their production in both how and what they produce. The nature of individuals depends on the material conditions determining their production. How far the productive forces of a nation are developed is shown by the degree to which the division of labor has been carried. Also, there's direct link between division of labor and forms of ownership. The ruling class, in ruling the material force of society, is simultaneously the ruling intellectual force of society. They regulate the production and distribution of ideas of their age. As the ruling class changes with time, so do the ideals, and the new ruling class must instill upon its society its own ideas, which will become universal. The ruling ideas are thought to be the universal interest. However, it is an illusion that the ideas of the ruling class are the communal interests, how we see that currently. This system will forever remain in place so long as society is organized around the need for a ruling class. To illustrate this theoretical framework, Marx draws on his formulation of base and superstructure, and this has, persisted, of course, in people's explanation of the differences and charges of elitism and all kinds of other stuff that the base and superstructure metaphor have persisted. The reality of it is that it's really just points on a circuit, but that's a whole nother thing. Historical development is a reflection of changes in the economic and material relations of the base. When the base changes, a revolutionary class becomes the new ruling class that forms the superstructure. So there is a kind of avant-gardism at work here. During revolution, the revolutionary class makes certain that its ideas appeal to humanity in general, so that after a successful revolution, these ideas appear natural and universal. You can argue that that's kind of what's going on with Trump. These ideas, which the superstructural elements of society propagate, then become the governing ideology of the historical period. Furthermore, the governing ideology mystifies the economic relations of society and therefore places the proletariat in a state of false consciousness that serves to reproduce the working class. And in fact, this is kind of what's going on, firing 6,000 FBI staff as retribution for the January 6th prosecution is sort of interesting to think about. On the other hand, a lot of that is lawyers, so maybe that's not so important. But the 6,000 out of 17,000 staff is sort of pretty significant. Morality, religion, metaphysics, and all the rest of ideology and their corresponding forms of consciousness no longer retain the semblance of independence. They have no history and no development. But people developing their material production and their material intercourse alter, along with their real existence, their thinking and the products of their collective thinking. So that's, I think the elements that we still continue to discuss, primitive accumulation, base and superstructure, ideology questions, all of those are sort of there. And So I found another little quote from a different text. This is on law and political economy. Um, it's a recent blog posting. If we're to find our way out of this dangerous moment, we need to learn from the strategies and tools that oligarchs and anti oligarchs alike have used to change our constitutional history. What we need is constitutionalism that engages deeply with the notion that capacious liberty and equality, indeed constitutional democracy itself, are contingent and must be fought for. And that's kind of where the current moment in history is. Um, and so there's a panel on um, alternative economic systems. And since I have a few minutes left, uh, we can start listening to this. It includes, I think, as you can see here, Rick Wolf, a bunch of other folks we've seen before. And let's see if we can watch that. Jeff Sachs, Radhika Desai, and Paulina, Steve Keen, Genevieve Vaughn. Oh no, it wasn't. I I mistook Steve Keen for.
A warm welcome to all panelists,
in profile, now I
viewers,
see it
and
is.
eavesdroppers globally to this panel on alternate.
But for some reason,
systems.
I'm not getting audio.
I'm Rajnikant, and I'll be moderating this session.
I could hear audio.
Was to suggest that there
exist
alternatives, some known and some possibly.
Is it still going?
Yeah.
Okay, carry on.
Cool.
To be discovered
as regards economic Is it still
systems. There? So we may need to do some thinking, and perhaps more importantly, rethinking. Our distinguished panelists today are Radhika Desai, Steve Keen, Anne Paulina, and Genevieve Vaughn. There's also very to appear towards the end of this session, if his schedule permits. The modus operandi is as follows. I will ask each panelist one query each in 2 separate rounds of questioning. In the first round, I asked them to explain the workings of the economic system they are to speak on. I have asked Radhika to speak on socialism, Steve on capitalism, Genevieve on unilateral gifting, and Anne on the economic being. They'll have 10 minutes each. The order of appearance is as follows: Radhika, Anne, and then Genevieve. In the second round, I'll be asking them to expound further the merits of the system as they see it. This time, they'll have 5 minutes each. Diane Wyckoff, our eminence Greece and IT host for this session, will firmly monitor these timings for all of us. If you like, Diane, you can say hello to everyone, or it's up to you.
Hello, everyone. I'm looking forward to it.
Lovely. So we will then thereafter move to a quick cross conversation. Regrettably, severe time constraints obviate the possibility of any viewer Q&A. By way of brief intro now, provision of the material prereqs of human existence lies in the general domain of what we call economics in the modern world. These can be produced and allocated in numerous ways. In modern times, solidified first in the European world, and since the 18th century, much of the world has been under the sway of what we understand as capitalism. Until recently, however, a large swath of human society has also lived under what was termed socialism. But long prior to both, humanity has lived under multiple variants of what I will simply call generically a tribal economy. Today, our panel will explain these disparate systems to indicate their modes of functioning and perhaps their raison d'etre. Possibly this discussion might help clarify matters as to the nature of the inherent differences between the systems, and who knows, maybe give us some new ideas as well. Of course, for the most part, such systems historically were not voted in by any form of majority consent. Some spontaneously evolved, some were imposed by force. So the idea of choosing between systems as options on a menu may be a very limiting notion. Rarely elect in modernist society a specific form of an economic system. Perhaps you might question why we don't. It is governing elites generally that make such choices when history affords them the option, and the rest of society goes along, consciously or unconsciously, agreeably or unhappily. Today, we might also speculate, and I use that term advisedly, whether there is some ideal economy that meets our needs, much as an ideal society, or are such notions mere chimera, simply utopian? At any rate, with that as a very hurried prologue, let's get started. Let me then first call upon Steve Keen to lead us into this discussion.
Well, thank you, Rajani. As my task has been to describe what capitalism is, and of course, that's rather like describing an elephant. It depends upon whether you grab the leg, the trunk, the body, etc., etc. And I think with our attempts to even think about the current system, let alone devise an alternative, has been polluted by the fact that we all have partial views of the system coming from various forms of ideology. And I've been trying for my whole academic career to try to get a set of grounded concepts which simply cannot be disagreed with, to say, well, what is actually the nature of capitalism? So I'm not going to talk about the labor theory of value for Marxists. I'm not going to talk about utility theory of value for neoclassicals. I'm going to look at what the system actually functions as, and it's the starting point is that capitalism is a monetary system of production. Money plays a vital role in a capitalist economy, and mainstream economics, which we call neoclassical economics, has completely ignored the money side. They haven't said that money doesn't matter, but they say that money only affects the inflation rate. It doesn't affect what they call the real level of output. Now, when you take a look at that using the absolutely essential tool for analyzing financial flows, which is double entry bookkeeping, their model simply doesn't make sense. It's a mythical model. And what I want to show very quickly is why that mythical model is why we're having financial crises right now, because people think the government is borrowing from the public. So I've built a software package I call Ravel, which enables me to model concepts like that. I'm going to quickly share my screen here. If this is a bit confusing, I apologize, but go to my Patreon or Substack site and you'll see things done rather more slowly there. So if you can see my screen at the moment, it should be coming up shortly. That is a Ravel model. And again, I don't have time to explain the overall logic there, but I want to focus on just one part of it, and that's show what banks are supposed to do according to economic textbooks. And that's now this screen, which is just taking out the banking section of that model. And that basically, the neoclassicals teach their poor students, their victims, that banks are what they call pure intermediaries. Banks don't actually lend money. They operate as an introduction service, introducing savers to borrowers. And the savers are households, the borrowers are firms, and also the government. And what you get out of that, and again, this is going to be too fast for great detail, but if you simulate it, what you find is the government borrowing money causes a runaway level in government debt. There's a percentage of GDP, it becomes absolutely unsustainable. It's growing very slowly there, but if I let that run for long enough, you'll see a level of debt reaching 200, 300, 400% of GDP. Interest payments ultimately become equal to GDP itself. It's obviously an unsustainable system. And that's the sort of thing that I think Elon Musk has in his brain, though he's not aware of it. It's equally the UK Treasurer, Rachel Reeves, the same sort of thing. Now, it takes me roughly a minute to go from that structure, which pretends that households are the lenders and banks are not, to the real world in which banks are the lenders. And that's the result of making that change. I make no other changes to the equations in the model. If I simulate the same thing, this time with the 5% of GDP deficit, so the government is spending 5% of GDP more than it gets back in taxes, there is no crisis because that process actually creates money. And that creation of money means that the rate of growth of the debt stabilizes down to the rate of growth of GDP itself. You can see the debt ratio there is curving down towards a horizontal asymptote, whereas previously it was going vertical. Now, that is one of the many myths that we have that obstructs how people think and reason about capitalism. Another side, and I'll do this rather more quickly, it's rather more mathematical. This is taking a set of purely, absolutely true by definition statements. The wages share of GDP, which is wages divided by GDP, the employment rate, which is employment divided by population, the private debt ratio, which is private debt divided by GDP, simply putting those together and making the simplest possible assumptions to link the system states. So workers' wage capacity to get wage demands depends upon the employment rate. Capital is willing to invest depends upon the profit rate. If you simulate that model, what you get is what's called a strange attractor in the system, which results ultimately in a debt deflation. Too much private debt is taken on. Private debt is something you can't repay. That ultimately leads to the point where the system collapses into zero employment, zero wage share, and an infinite private debt ratio. Now, that is what government spending actually counteracts. It doesn't let that happen. But because we have all these myths created by neoclassical economists at one extreme and labor theory value Marxists at the other, and this actually originates from a non-labor theory of value element of Marxist thought back in the 1860s. What we've ended up with is a system where we're destabilizing an unstable system by trying to reduce government spending and having more and more crises and so on. So unless we understand that capitalism is a monetary system of production, and we understand government's role in that is by counter-cyclical spending to stop it falling into a debt deflation, we have bizarre notions about how to make capitalism better. And I think that's a major reason why we are on the cusp of a whole series of catastrophes, which I largely relate to climate change now. But that poisons our brains. We have to get a clear picture of how the system we live in works before we can talk about reforming.
I was just saying, are you done? Oh, you obviously are. Okay.
Okay, so, and you want me to talk about socialism, and that's what I'll do. So I thought I would begin by kind of going back to first principles. Why do we need socialism? Because in a certain sense, what Steve is saying is that capitalism can be improved, its performance can be improved and made a more desirable form of society than we have at the moment. And no doubt there were times when capitalism was on much better behavior, and has seen therefore better times. Having said that, I think the political possibilities of that kind of transformation that Steve is talking about are basically diminishing to a vanishing point. So from my point of view, if we went to go back, we talk about socialism, let's start by going back to first principles. Firstly, socialism is not a form of economy. The idea that the economy is separate from society is a fiction. It's a fiction which is not even true in capitalism, although in capitalism, it is a necessary fiction. In reality, society, politics, economics, etc., all form a historical whole. So we are not talking about an economic system, but a form of society. And I would be sufficiently Marxist to say that until our capacity to produce becomes so great as to release us from spending most of our waking hours making a living, release most of humanity from that, the form of society will be determined by the manner in which we choose to produce and reproduce our livelihoods. Also, secondly, another first point I want to make is that it's not really a question of what individuals such as you or I prefer, but what society and the world ends up fighting for, because we cannot create the society we want from a clean slate. We have to start from here to get there, wherever there is. But here, we know what here is. Steve has been, it's kind of a bit of the opposite of what Steve was saying, in the sense that he was implicitly criticizing the kind of society in which we live. So with these provisos, I would say that my preferred form of society would be one that sets the three key relationships that we have right. Our relationship with nature, our relationship with society, namely each other, and our relationship to ourselves. And in my humble opinion, it can only be a form of socialism, with our relationship with nature assuming the eco-socialist bit, and a relationship to society also assuming that our relationships are relationships of thriving, not exploitation, and do not involve things like patriarchy, misogyny, racism, etc., etc. Okay, so and so to me, that society, this kind of society, will be capable of developing to a historically unprecedented extent, what Marx and Engels referred to when they were talking about the productive forces that slumber in the lap of social labor. There is a very widespread belief that capitalism is the only system capable of doing that. But I think that we are already living in times when the capitalist system is stymieing the further development of human productive capacities, human social productive capacities. And I think that this should be allowed to, socialism will allow that to allow that to advance further by freeing up human creativity, by freeing up our capacity to cooperate with one another rather than exploit and conflict with one another. It must also be egalitarian in the sense of both within a society, among people, within a people, and between peoples, and therefore not based on the ability of some to exploit others, whether the others are individuals or entire societies. And of course, it must permit the freest and fullest development of art and culture. Now, this does not necessarily involve creating a command economy, although with the development of information technology, we are much closer today than we were even, say, 3 decades ago when the Soviet Union collapsed, to having the capacity to plan fairly comprehensively and fairly minutely what needs to be produced with sufficient feedback loops in order to enable us to not have the problems that Soviet planning had. And in fact, it's not a surprise that it was the Soviets who made some of the first advances in cybernetic technology, precisely because for them, having better information technology was a real world problem of planning. So that's another point that I would make. So it doesn't have to be about creating a command economy, although creating a command economy is much easier today than it was before. It can allow a significant level of private enterprise. But of course, this private enterprise can only exist within an overall framework of a planned economy. Socialism, therefore, is not really about markets versus the state, but really about who controls the state, and is it big capital that controls the state or state that controls capital? And I think once we have the latter form, we are already well advanced on the road to some kind of socialism. Whether or not we arrive at the end to a point at which there is no capital, there is no state, etc., we would have to see, but certainly we would be on the way there. Yeah. And there are some other advantages to this sort of society. I would say that one advantage is that it would really address real wants rather than simulated wants. We are always told when we take Economics 101 that the market, the free market, supplies us with what we need. No, that's not what markets do, or at least, well, first of all, markets aren't actors, markets are arenas. In these arenas, actors, namely capitalist firms, small or large, supply you with what they can supply, and they try to persuade you to want what they have to supply. And in this process, they create a lot of simulative needs, a lot of products that are actually harmful to us rather than helpful to us, that harm our physical as well as increasingly our mental health, and we would be free of that. It's also society. Steve spoke about money. I would say that, I wouldn't say that capitalism is necessarily, that money is unique to capitalism. There have been money systems in practically every ancient society because some form of accounting is always necessary in every society. So I would say that while, in fact, money predates capitalism by centuries, perhaps even millennia. So in that sense, but nevertheless, in a socialist society, money would be a tool of planning. Money would be a way of reckoning exactly where resources are being deployed, with what results, what products are being produced, consumed, etc., etc. And that's what the money system would be devoted to. So all in all, I would say that socialism is, for centuries, people have thought about socialism. Whenever you ask people about the kind of society they want to see, they invariably talk about all the things that we take to be socialist, involving greater equality, but also greater freedom. Capitalism claims to be about freedom, but is in reality only about freedom of some. It's about the freedom of Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos to take trips to space at obscene prices, while, of course, their own compatriots, let alone people in the rest of the world, are living below poverty lines, are undernourished even, let alone having other problems, including debt and so on. So these are some of the dimensions of socialism that I would emphasize. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. Now I'll call upon Anne, and she's going to speak about economic well-being and I suppose social well-being as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'm not an economist, so I'm coming from a different language and a different frame. So my name is Anne Paulina. I'm from the Kimberley in Western Australia, in Australia. It's a really interesting conversation because we are the oldest culture in the world, and for our people to have lived for so long with the focus of peace, harmony and balance, and now being in a situation where we've been confronted with colonialism and this capital concept of money, 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 where the world we inherited was about a duty of care and a moral obligation, because we see ourselves as coming from a world of we and not me. So the individualism is not really a frame that we aspire to. So it's about the collective well-being of everyone and everything around us. So it's a really interesting conversation we're having because, as I said, our people lived and traded and had all of the things that, you were just, the previous speaker was talking about: relationship, respect, reciprocity, and with rights comes responsibility. So it was indeed about the greater good of all of us, including how we see our non-human kin, the ability to reach your full potential as a human being. So now we're confronted with a new system through colonialism, which is very much about the me and not the we, and looking at, how we achieve the things that we look at. So because I'm in Australia, which is, a lucky country and very, very wealthy, my people still live in fourth world conditions, and we still live with colonialism. There is no post-colonialism. So what we continue to have is invasive, unjust development, where it's top-down centralised power that is toxic and telling us how we're going to consume everything we know. I mean, there's a new conversation globally happening at the moment around the nature repair market, and it seems a shame that we've had to destroy biodiversity to create a market. So all of these things are fairly new for us in terms of how do we shift from poverty to wealth creation when we're living in a colonial system very much focused on capitalism and grow, 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 which is now, with the confrontation of climate change, it can't be business as usual. It cannot. And so all of the systems that we heavily rely on as Indigenous people is from nature. Our food, our medicine, our therapeutic ability to ignite our spirit and connect with nature and see that as kin. So what we have is a total clash of values, and who is counting those values and how they are actually accounted for. So it's a really interesting conversation in terms of one of the things that I'm doing with our people is trying to look at, is it business as usual? And so part of that conversation is, what is the situational analysis? Because we always governed on scale. We always governed on a bioregional perspective that looked at, in a way, cumulative impacts. If you do something up on the river, it's going to impact on me down the river. If you're going to clear vast areas of land, the savanna system, what is that? I've just produced a film, and one of the things that's in that film is we're looking at water justice and climate justice because they go hand in hand. But one of the stories that one of the scientists talks about is he was confronted with a conversation where they were looking to divert water, and this traditional owner said to the scientists, always be careful and understand that you know what that water was doing before you shifted it. So water is the new gold. As it gets more and more rare around the world, it becomes scarcity and the price goes up. So this is what we're saying, is that as Indigenous people, we look at this and we go, okay, how do all of those things that we care about that makes us human and gives us that opportunity to reach our full potential. How do we bring that in? So one of the things that we have decided to do with the work I do is have a look at the situational analysis. What is the business as usual model? How is it going to impact on human beings and the environment and all of those things that we care about and value and hold close to us? How is that going to happen? So part of that is understanding what is the intention of government? What is the intention of those who hold power in terms of changing our quality of life and the system that we have guarded as traditional owners and care for as diligent stewards? How is this going to change the world that we have inherited and we continue to care for? So it's really important to understand unjust development on unjust terms and look at how do we as Indigenous people, particularly in Australia, start to look at what could be the opportunities before we destroy them. This place that I live is possibly one of the last rivers in the world that remains beautiful and flowing and doing all these amazing things. What happens when you change, in a way, a language that I've heard is, how do you rebuild a river? What is the cost of that? What does that cost to us socially, culturally, human, and spiritual? How do those values come into a systems thinking which is all about more and more production and more business as usual? So one of the things that we've started to look at is, how do we build and change the frame of economy, caring for our home, caring for the environment in which we live, which gives us everything? So many people may not know, but in Australia we live in fourth world conditions where we don't even have water fit for human consumption. And all we see is the agenda of growth, growth, growth. And we kind of figure that where we are as a species, a human species in terms of humanity, is that we need to have a pause and reflect on the world that we want our young people to inherit. And so for us, it's really looking at what are those development projects that would give us a purpose and a freedom for development that could change our whole world. So we're working with a whole range of people. One, to understand what are the propositions for unjust development on unjust terms. How can we have an alternative narrative that brings the people with us? Can we develop business that is great for all of us, or do we just continue to service the predatory elite? So from this perspective, one of the things is first understanding what is the intention of government. What do they want to do that is going to change our world, our life views? How do we look at these systems? And one of the things where I live is that water is free. There is no water market, there's no water trading. So right now we're in a situation where our government is giving a public commodity, which is water, to the richest people in the world to profit, and that is supposed to be equity. So for us, it's looking at the world from an Indigenous perspective, realizing that we're living in a system. But one of the things that we're saying is that let's go back to basics. If we are going to survive as a human species, what are those core values that have meaning and depth and bring us into that conversation? So we're looking at, some of the different economic models around the world where we don't need to destroy the environment. Is there an alternative narrative that says that we can do these things and we can do it so that we reach our full potential? So one of the things we're very much focused on is those things that kept us together as a society, as human beings, which is around social capital, human capital, cultural capital, and we're living in a capitalist system, so we need some of that real money. So this is what we're doing. We're looking at where are those models, such as what Nelson Mandela developed, which was global geoparks. Why can't we bring people to country to experience this? That this is a beautifully biodiverse place with an amazing river, which is diverse, which we have just been noted as the first in the world for developing a living water museum. How does all this diversity, the biodiversity, the cultural diversity, how does that all come into play so that we can reach our full potential as human beings and experience the world under our due inheritance to share with fellow Australians and global citizens? So we're looking at these situations of business as usual, what are the new economies, and we are calling it the economics of well-being, because we believe that without all of these other sorts of values that we are sustaining, we can never be fully human. So for us, it's about a word that we are, in a way, coming up with, which is communityism. How do we as a community function together? How do we have a dream to reach our full potential, to ensure young people reach their full potential? So it's really dreaming new ways. Yeah, it is dreaming new ways that we can enjoy where we're living, not be destroyed by invasive, unjust development, and share this economics of well-being with people who want to come and walk on their country, learn and listen from Indigenous wisdom, polycentric governance, bottom-up stuff, away from the toxic centralised power. But how can we dream a new dream so that our young people, both Indigenous and not, can reach their full potential, but still have access to these amazing places so that they can experience what it is to be human? Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now I'll ask Genevieve to talk to us about unilateral gift giving.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I'm so happy to be here with you, all of you. We are at a disastrous point in human history. Something is terribly wrong. And this is my attempt at a diagnosis. I believe that repeated giving and receiving and passing it on form the original template for human life. I come to this from semiotics rather than directly from economics, and I have written about communication and language as giving and receiving, satisfying one another's communicative and cognitive needs. The same kind of process holds for satisfying one another's physical life needs. Marcel Mauss described a gift economy as creating human relations in 3 steps: giving, receiving, and giving back. He did not realize that the first 2 steps already create a human relation, and that this happens in every viable life in infancy and early childhood, creating an important early model of unilateral giving and receiving. In fact, some researchers consider the care given to adults as the turning point in human evolution, as shown in the book Costly and Cute: Helpless Infants and Human Evolution, edited by Wenda Trevathan and Karen Rosenberg. The care elicited by the early hominid child, not only from the mother, but from the grandmother and other members of the family and group, had a decisive part in human socialization and community formation. The care of young children has to be unilateral because the children cannot survive on their own. In fact, they are born with underdeveloped brains because their heads have to fit through the birth canal that is made narrow by the necessity of upright posture for bipedalism. Thus, the necessity of unilateral care by adults and older children. The model of unilateral care giving has therefore been present since primordial times, much older than quid pro quo, market exchange, and money. And it is still present in early childhood and maternal care today. In fact, it is so prevalent that we should actually call ourselves Homo donans instead of Homo sapiens, because we are really a giving and receiving being, but we don't know that we are. I consider the so-called domestic sphere of the capitalist economy as the modern day continuation of our original species being as Homo donans, while the market sphere is a mechanism for taking, amassing, and redistributing gifts, thereby creating a predatory social mutation, Homo economicus, a species that uses the capitalist market to direct the gifts of the many towards an ever more powerful few. Here too, the species does not know what it is doing, and so it is not even Homo sapiens, nor especially Homo sapiens sapiens, because it does not know that it does not know. and this seems to give it license to experiment with everything. Unilateral gifts are not seen as such, and this is a circumstance that protects the market from recognizing its dependence upon them. Instead, they are called housework, unwaged work, surplus labor, or in Jason Moore's term in his book, The Rise and Fall of Cheap Nature, they are the four cheaps: cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials. Refocusing our lens, we can see that they are cheap because a large portion of them is free and a gift to the receiver. Exploitation itself is leveraging free gifts from others by force or deception, backed up by social structures such as private property, the market, and the law. Moore rejects the idea that the destructive era we are living in should be called the Anthropocene, and instead proposes the Capitalocene. I agree with this because I do not think the human being as Homo donans is responsible for this disaster. Rather, it is the economically distorted species of Homo economicus, altered by capitalism towards solipsistic egotism, power, and the predation of gifts. Moreover, in the USA, these considerations also hold for corporations that have the same rights as individuals and have been able, through funding the denial of climate change, to continue and even expand their destructive extractive practices to the detriment of all. In fact, the capitalist economy is a gift extracting mechanism that survives and thrives by creating ever new ways to discover, elicit, and capture gifts of profit. These include progress in manufacturing, agriculture, medicine, armaments, and the academic institutions that supply the necessary research and validation to foster their elaboration, to improve upon them, and to frame and promote the improvements as gifts to humanity. Cute and costly infants continue to promote their own survival by eliciting unilateral gifts of nurture and care in the world today, just as they did in prehistory, making us evolve into Homo donans, communitary beings, a species perfectly adapted to living on Mother Earth, receiving, caring for, and sharing her gifts. Most unfortunately, capitalism and the drive for accumulation and patriarchal power have made some parts of our species parasitic on others and on the earth without knowing it themselves. They are not sapients, and they don't know that they don't know. But neither do the hosts usually know that they are giving unilaterally to them through a gift-taking mechanism. We have come to a terrible three-pronged turning point. On the one hand, we have genocide caused by power and land-hungry national leaders in sync with similar leaders in other nations who gift them with genocidal armaments. On the other, we have the destruction of a major city caused by climate gone berserk from the poisonous pollution poured into it. Pictures of Gaza and LA look alike. They are two views of the destruction caused by the same disease. Rubble and scorched earth in both cases. And over it all hangs the nuclear threat, held back by who knows what thin threads of reason belonging to career war makers. Still, it is not our species, Homo donans, that has done this, but Homo economicus. We have to return quickly to the unilateral gift economy that we learned as children from our nurturers. Unilateral gifting seems impossible for most people, even godlike. But it is commonplace, as I have been saying, for motherers of small children who require it for their survival. Freeing unilateral gifting from the gift-plundering capitalism can allow the validation of the satisfaction of needs beyond exchange. There are many experiments in gifting: free stores, buy nothing groups, online sharing networks, eco-villages, transition towns. Solidarity and activist organizations and individuals devote their lives to solving social problems by creating the gift of social change. There are many hybrids. Even political parties are motivated by some people trying to make things better. And they try to do this by eliciting the gifts of donations.
1 minute, 1 minute.
Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. Maybe you get the general gist, but
You have 1 minute, Genevieve.
well, I don't have the time to say what I need to say.
You do have 1 minute, so you can continue.
Okay. Well, I believe that by reinstating a gift economy and the values of the gift economy, we can begin to transition away from this deadly economy that we are in towards some kind of way of living that is in harmony with the earth.
Well, thank you, Genevieve. I'm sorry that you weren't able to conclude.
Okie doke. Ready to stop our little live stream. That was a panel on alternative economic systems with Jeff Sachs, or originally supposed as by Jeff Sachs, Radhika Desai, Ann Polina, Steve Keen, and Genevieve Vaughn. The chair of this is Rajani Kenneth. I assume Jeff Sachs had to bomb out. It would have been interesting to hear Jeff Sachs just simply because he has a, with all due respect, somewhat reactionary position on so many other things. That would have been a fight to watch. Anyway, I'll drop the link back into the chat, and then we'll shut off the live stream so we can get on in preparation for other matters. The link is in the chat, and let me thank everyone for your indulgence. And we will return to our regularly scheduled stuff here.